Of course I knew the risks. That's the thing people never want to hear, but it's true. Of course I knew. I'd been in hospitality my entire working life. I'd built 3 businesses from scratch in Australia, sold 2 of them at a profit, and watched the third one nearly destroy me before I found a buyer and got out at 58 with enough to breathe again. I understood contracts. I understood structures. I understood the difference between the story someone tells you about an opportunity and the legal reality underneath it. I had been lied to by suppliers, undercut by partners, ambushed by landlords, and stitched up by an accountant who turned out to be running his own sideline in creative interpretation. I had survived all of it. So when people tell me now that I should have known, that a man with my background should have seen it coming, I want to be very clear. I did see it. I saw every piece of it. And I chose to believe that seeing the risk was the same as managing it. That is the specific mistake that cost me AUD $612,000, a resort on Koh Samui, and the last real dream I had left. My name is Marcus. I am 61 years old. I am telling you this from a rented apartment in the Surrey Hills neighborhood of Sydney, which is not where I expected to be at 61. And the woman who put me here is running the resort I built with a man who was her partner the entire time I knew her. I'll tell you about that. I'll tell you all of it. But I want to start with the part that nobody starts with. Because the beginning is where the real damage was done, and the beginning was not in Thailand. I had a reputation, earlier in my life, that I was not proud of. Reformed playboy is a charitable description, and I'll take it. In my 30s and most of my 40s, I was not a man who treated relationships with any particular seriousness. I was focused on the businesses, on the deals, on the next acquisition, and the women in my life during that period were mostly incidental to the main story I was telling myself about who I was and where I was going. I had 3 significant relationships, and I handled all 3 of them badly in different ways, always prioritizing the work, always assuming there would be time later to become the person I intended to be. By the time I was 50 and starting to understand the actual cost of that approach, it was too late to undo most of it. My daughter from the first relationship barely spoke to me. The woman I'd been with for 6 years in my 40s had married someone else, and seemed, from a distance, genuinely happier than I'd ever made her. I had money, and I had professional credibility, and I had very little else. The hotel chain, 4 boutique properties across Queensland and New South Wales, started with a single guest house in Byron Bay that I bought for next to nothing in 2001, and turned around in 3 years. By 2017, I had 4 properties under a shared brand, reasonable occupancy rates, and a management structure that mostly ran without me. When a mid-tier hospitality group approached me about acquiring the portfolio at a price I hadn't expected, I spent 4 months negotiating and then signed. The total came to AUD $4.1 million. After debts, outstanding loans, staff settlement obligations, and the tax liability, I walked away with $720,000. I was 58. I was tired in the specific way of a man who has been productive his entire life and cannot remember what rest feels like. And I had, for the first time in decades, absolutely nothing requiring my attention. My first visit to Thailand was in late 2018, with a friend named Craig, who had retired from construction the previous year, and spent most of our 3 weeks there trying to convince me to do the same. Craig had been coming to Thailand for holidays since the early 2000s, and had a specific enthusiasm for Koh Samui that he communicated with the evangelical certainty of a man who had found something he believed was being undersold to the world. We spent the first week in Bangkok, which I found overwhelming in a way I found oddly invigorating, and then flew south to Samui, where Craig had a favorite guest house near Chaweng Beach that he stayed in every time. I remember the afternoon we arrived clearly. The air was thick and wet and smelled of frangipani and 2-stroke engines, and something frying nearby that I couldn't identify, and I stood outside the guest house with my bag at my feet and thought, I could do something with this. Not a holiday thought, a professional thought. The reflex of a man who had spent 30 years looking at underperforming hospitality assets and seeing what they could become. That instinct was not wrong exactly. The island had genuine appeal, The combination of beaches, accessibility from Bangkok, an established tourist infrastructure, and a growing market of higher-end visitors who wanted something more curated than the standard backpacker experience. What was wrong was everything I did with that instinct afterward. I met Bue at an industry event in Chaweng in March of 2019. Craig had dragged me along to what turned out to be a semi-formal networking evening for hospitality professionals on the island. Resort owners, tour operators, booking agents, a few architects who specialized in villa construction. Bue was working the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood exactly how these events functioned and what they were for. She was 30 at the time, managing operations at a mid-range resort near the north of the island, and she spoke about the Samui hospitality market with a specificity and technical fluency that I found immediately credible. She knew occupancy cycles. She knew the booking platforms. She understood the structural difference between the properties that succeeded on the island long-term and the ones that didn't. When she talked about the gap in the market for a properly designed boutique resort in the right location, not on the main strip, but close enough to benefit from the infrastructure, she was talking the language I had spoken for 30 years. I listened to her for about 40 minutes and then gave her my number and flew back to Bangkok the following morning. We spoke by phone 3 times over the following 3 weeks. Professional calls, mostly, though the professional and the personal were already beginning to blend in a way I was aware of, but not concerned about. By the end of April, I was back on Samui. By mid-month in the second visit, I had seen 4 potential sites. By June, Bue and I were having dinners that were not about business in any simple sense, and I was telling myself that the professional relationship and the personal one were separate things that I was managing with appropriate clarity. Looking back at that now, I can see exactly what I was doing. I was 60 years old, and I wanted to build one more thing, and I had found someone who understood what I wanted to build, and I confused that understanding for intimacy. It is a version of a mistake I had made several times before, in different forms, and I had not learned from any of them. The site we eventually settled on was inland from Lamai Beach, about 2 kilometers back from the coast, on a gentle slope that gave partial sea views from the upper level of any structure built on the upper third of the land. 4 rea of land, which is just under 2 acres. The price was 11.2 million baht, at the exchange rate then, approximately AUD $480,000. Wei had connections with the landowner and negotiated what she said was a significant reduction from the asking price. And I had no reason to doubt this because I didn't have enough local knowledge to verify it, and I trusted her professional credibility. The construction estimate for a 12-villa boutique resort. The design she and I had developed over several working sessions with an architect she recommended, a Thai man named Anurak who had done similar projects in Phuket, came to approximately 7.8 million baht. Another $335,000 at the rate. Total project cost with fit-out and operating capital, something north of AUD $900,000. I had $720,000 available. I told Bue I could cover the land and a significant portion of construction if she could arrange the remainder through her industry contacts, and she said she could. I did not ask how. I should have, but she said she could, and I believed her, because she had been credible about everything else, and because what I wanted was to build the resort, and her ability to handle what I couldn't handle was the thing that made the whole project possible, and if I asked too many precise questions about that particular part of the arrangement, I risked learning something that would complicate a decision I had already made emotionally. I want to be honest about that. It is not a comfortable thing to say about yourself, but it is accurate. The business structure was explained to me by Bue in July 2019 over dinner at a restaurant in Nathon, the administrative capital of the island, while I was eating a green curry that was too hot and didn't want to admit it. Foreign nationals cannot own land in Thailand. This I already knew. The standard structure for foreign investment in property-based businesses involves a Thai company with a minimum of 51% Thai shareholding, with the foreign investor holding a minority stake and typically holding a long-term lease over the land to secure their position. Bui walked me through this as though it were entirely standard, which in outline it is, because in outline it is. She explained that she would hold the Thai shareholding as the majority director, that I would be the minority foreign director, and that a lease arrangement would protect my investment. She recommended using her own lawyer to handle the documentation, a man named Arthit, whom she described as experienced in structures of this kind. I said I would want my own legal advice as well. She said, of course, that was sensible, whatever I needed. I did get independent legal advice. I want to be clear about that because I know what you are thinking. I found a law firm in Bangkok, an international firm with a Thai property practice, through the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Thailand, and I paid them to review the structure. They confirmed that the proposed company structure was legally standard, that the minority foreign shareholding was consistent with Thai law, and that the lease arrangement, if properly documented, was a reasonable protection for my investment. They flagged, as a general caution, that the quality of the protection depended entirely on the quality of the documentation and the good faith of the Thai majority shareholder. I noted this. I read their report, and I proceeded. What neither I nor my Bangkok lawyers knew was that Arthit, the lawyer Bui recommended, was not a general property lawyer with experience in foreigner investment structures. He was Bui's partner. They had been together for 6 years. They had an apartment in Nathon that was registered in her name. They had, between them, done this before. Not with a resort of this scale, but with 2 smaller properties, where Bui had established business relationships with foreign investors who contributed capital to projects that were then structured in ways that left the foreigner with a minority position in a Thai company whose majority director had every incentive and legal ability to eventually marginalize them. I did not know any of this in July 2019. I knew that Arthit seemed professionally competent and was pleasant to deal with. I knew that the documentation he produced looked thorough. I had my Bangkok lawyers review the company incorporation documents and the lease, and I knew that everything appeared to be in order. What the documentation did not reveal, because it was not required to reveal it, was that Arthit had structured the Thai company's Articles of Association in a way that gave the majority Thai director, Bui, the ability to approve or block any significant decision, and that the shares he held as a third party in the company were not held on his own behalf, but on behalf of an entity that was connected to Bui's family. This is not illegal in Thailand. It is standard. It is also, when used with this specific intent, the structural skeleton of a trap. Construction began in September 2019. I was on site 3 or 4 days a week, working alongside the construction team, reviewing progress with Anurak the architect, making the 1,000 small decisions that building a hospitality property requires, about materials and finishes and layout and light. I found this part genuinely, deeply satisfying in a way I had not expected. I had been an operator, not a builder. I had bought and sold and managed, but I had never started with raw land and a design and watched something emerge from it over months. There is something almost physical about the pleasure of that process. The smell of concrete in the morning heat, the sound of tiling going down in the first villa bathroom. Walking the site in the late afternoon, when the light came across the slope in a way insorg that made you understand exactly why you had chosen this particular piece of ground. Bui was present, but not consistently. Her operations role at the North Island Resort continued through the first phase of construction, and I accepted this. She had a salary and professional obligations, and I was not in a position to replace her income. She was there on weekends usually, and during the week she was available by phone. I noticed, from about November onward, that her phone calls during site visits were sometimes taken away from where I was standing, and that the conversations, conducted in Thai, which I had no meaningful grasp of despite months of effort, seemed at times more intense than I would have expected from routine professional calls. I mentioned this to her once. She said it was a difficult staffing situation at the North Island Resort and she was dealing with it. I accepted this because I wanted to, and because I had too much else to think about. There was a moment in January 2020. This was 4 months into construction, and the first 3 villas were taking shape, and I was starting to feel the first real electricity of the thing becoming real, when Craig came to visit. He spent 3 days on the island, toured the site, had dinner with Bue and me, and on the last evening, after she had gone home, sat across from me at a beach bar in Lamai, and said something I have thought about almost every day since. He said he had noticed that Bue never talked about the future of the resort, as though it included me. Not in an obvious way, not in a way he could point to exactly, but in a structural way. When she talked about the property in the long term, she used we in a sense that seemed to exclude me rather than include me. He said he might be wrong. He said he hoped he was wrong. And then he finished his beer and caught his taxi to the airport and flew home. And I sat on the beach in the dark for a while, and then told myself that Craig had always been slightly overcautious, and that this was his reaction to seeing me do something ambitious without him, and that the dynamic Bui and I had built was more complicated than a 3-day visitor could understand. I was wearing a white linen shirt that evening that I'd bought at a market in Nathan. I still have it somewhere. I never wore it again after everything fell apart. Funny, the things you hold on to. The COVID interruption in early 2020 is a separate story that I won't go into in detail, except to say that it delayed construction by approximately 8 months and gave me an extended period of being stuck in Thailand with limited ability to progress the project, during which time I transferred an additional AUD $68,000 to cover fixed costs, land tax, company fees, staff retainers for the 2 workers Bue had employed in anticipation of the opening, and watched my available capital compress in ways that made completing the resort feel increasingly urgent rather than increasingly exciting. By the time construction resumed properly in late 2020, I had spent AUD $552,000. The original project budget had been $900,000 odd. I needed the remaining construction to come in within the balance I had available, and it did not. There were cost overruns. Some legitimate material prices had changed. One of the original villa designs needed to be modified because of drainage issues on the slope. The pool specification had to be upgraded when the original contractor's work failed inspection. Some I could not verify because they were presented to me through Arthit, in Thai language documentation that Bue translated, and the figure I was given each time was the figure I had to work with. By February 2021, the resort was substantially complete. 10 of the 12 villas finished, the central pavilion and restaurant done, the pool operational, the gardens planted. It was, genuinely, beautiful. I had built something beautiful. I remember standing at the top of the slope on the morning of what we called the soft opening walkthrough, looking down across the terraced villas toward the partial sea view in the distance, and feeling a pride that was specific and physical and real. I had made this. For the first time in my life, I had made something that was not just profitable, but genuinely worth making. Total invested at that point, AUD $612,000, which was AUD $108,000 more than I had available at the project's start. The overage covered by drawing on a line of credit I had maintained in Australia, against some residual assets. My liquid position at that moment was approximately $85,000. That is important to understand. By the time the trap closed, I was not a man with options. I was a man who had committed everything and had very little room to maneuver. The call came in April. Not a phone call. An email, forwarded to me by my Bangkok lawyers, who had received it from a contact in the Koh Samui Land Registry office. The sender was a man whose name I did not recognize. His English was careful and formal, the English of a person who writes in it occasionally but with precision. He said he had information about the company that owned the resort where I was a minority director. He said he had previously had a business relationship with an associate of the majority director that had ended badly. He said he believed I should know that the Thai company's structure contained a provision I was unlikely to be aware of. He included 3 documents. He said he was not doing this out of generosity, but out of an interest in preventing the same people from repeating what they had done to him. I read the email 3 times before I opened the documents. I remember that the fan in my villa, I had been living in one of the completed guest villas since construction finished, which seemed sensible and which Bue had encouraged, was making a low rattling sound it had been making for a week. I had been meaning to have it looked at. I opened the first document, It was the Articles of Association for the Thai company that owned the resort. Not the version I had reviewed with my Bangkok lawyers, which showed Bue as the 51% majority Thai director, and me as the 49% minority foreign director. A different version. The version filed with the Department of Business Development in Bangkok. The operative version. The one that existed in law. In this version, the Thai shareholding was split differently. Bue held 26%. Arthit, identified in this document not as a legal advisor but as a co-director and shareholder, held 25%. And the remaining 49% of the Thai portion, 49% of 51%, which is approximately 25% of the entire company, was held by a third entity, a Thai limited company whose registered address was in Nathon, whose sole director was a person whose name I did not recognize, and whose parent company, when I followed the second document's corporate trail, was registered to Bue's family. I sat on the edge of the bed in that villa, and I read the numbers 3 more times. If the structure in the operative articles was accurate, then the total shareholding controlled by Bue, directly and indirectly, was approximately 51%. My 49% was real. My lease was real. But the company I was a 49% shareholder in was controlled in every practical and legal sense by Bue and Arthit, who were partners, who had structured this together from the beginning, and who had the ability to outvote me on every significant decision, approve any expenditure, change any management arrangement, or, and this is what I understood with a cold and sudden clarity, seek to dilute my position through a new share issuance that I had no power to block. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that. I thought they would be, but they weren't. What I felt was something closer to recognition than shock. The specific recognition of a man who, deep down, had known something was wrong and had chosen not to pursue that knowing to its conclusion, now confronted with the conclusion anyway. I rang my Bangkok lawyers at 8:30 in the morning. One of the partners, a woman named Quanta, was in the office and took the call. I read her the relevant sections of the operative articles. There was a pause. She asked me to email her the documents immediately. I did. She rang back 47 minutes later. She confirmed that the operative articles were, in her assessment, valid and filed. She said the version she had reviewed during the company setup was a draft version that had not been the final filed document. She said this was a sophisticated substitution. The structure of the draft had been close enough to the final that the substantive difference in shareholding allocation was not immediately obvious without comparing the two documents side by side. She was professional and precise, and did not apologize, because there was no apology that would have been useful. She said I needed to come to Bangkok. I said I would come that week. I did not tell Bue what I had learned. Not yet. I flew to Bangkok on a Wednesday, spent 2 days with the lawyers going through every document, and then sat in their conference room on a Friday afternoon while Quanta told me what she believed my position was. The operative articles gave Bue's coalition majority control. My lease was valid for 30 years and gave me occupancy rights over the land, but the company that operated the resort, the company that collected revenue, employed staff, held the operating licenses, was controlled by her. She could, in theory, cease operating the resort in a way that made my lease valueless while she found another path forward. She could approve a new share issuance. She could vote to remove me as director. I could contest all of this. The legal system in Thailand for disputes of this kind was not fast and was not cheap, and the outcomes were uncertain. The realistic picture, Quanta said carefully, was that my position was substantially compromised. I flew back to Samui. I did not sleep on the flight. I landed and went directly to the resort rather than to the villa. Bue was there. She was in the central pavilion, at the desk we had set up as the operations center, working through what appeared to be booking inquiries. The resort had been accepting reservations for 2 months. We had 12 bookings confirmed for the first operating quarter. We had built something that was working. She looked up when I walked in and smiled. The particular warm and focused smile I had come to associate with her. The one that had always made me feel that she was genuinely glad I was there. I put the email and the 3 documents on the desk in front of her. She looked at them for a moment. She did not reach for them. She looked at me instead. And what I saw on her face was not the expression of someone who had been caught doing something they were ashamed of. It was the expression of someone who had known this moment would come and had decided, at some point long before it arrived, how to handle it. "You went to lawyers," she said. "I did. This is business structure," she said. "Standard Thai company. You knew this when you signed." "I didn't know Arthit was your partner," I said. She did not deny it. She looked at me with a patience that felt, in that moment, like contempt. "Arthit is good lawyer. Very experienced. Structure is correct. The structure that gives you and him majority control of my resort. Thai law," she said. "You understand Thai law, yes? Cannot own land. Cannot own majority. This is normal. It's not my resort, is it? That's what you're telling me." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sound of one of the groundskeepers working near the pool. A bird I could never identify that called from the trees on the slope every morning. A bright descending whistle. I had liked that sound. I had thought, more than once, that I would hear it every morning for the rest of my life. "You have lease," she said finally. "Very strong lease. 30 years. That's worth nothing if you stop operating the company." She did not respond to that. Over the following 2 weeks, through a combination of confrontations that I will spare you the full detail of, the picture clarified. Arthit was her partner in both the legal and the personal sense. They had not separated. They had never separated. The story Bue had told me about her previous relationship ending before we met was, as far as I could determine, entirely invented. The 2 smaller property deals before mine had followed a similar pattern. The anonymous email's author was a German man named Lucas, who had invested in a Chawang restaurant property 2 years earlier through the same basic structure, and had discovered the same thing I had discovered, and who had eventually reached a settlement, the details of which he declined to share, that allowed him to exit with a partial recovery. He had contacted me, he confirmed when I reached him by email, because he had heard through the Expat network on the island that a new foreign investor was building something at scale with the same people, and he had decided that this time he would not stay silent. Lucas turned out to be the thing that saved what could be saved. Because of his email, I had discovered the structure before Bue and Arthit had taken the steps that would have completed the consolidation of their position, specifically a proposed share issuance that Arthit had drafted and that was apparently scheduled to go to a company vote within weeks of the soft opening. The issuance would have diluted my 49% to approximately 19% and transferred the additional shares to the third entity controlled by Bue's family. Once that happened, my lawyers told me, my position became essentially uncontestable in practical terms. Because I found out when I did, I had leverage I would not have had a month later. Not comfortable leverage. Not the leverage of someone with a strong legal position, but the leverage of someone who knows enough to make the alternative to a negotiated settlement sufficiently complicated and expensive that the other party has reasons to consider it. My Bangkok lawyers negotiated. Arthit apparently had expected me to be slower to react than I was, and the speed of my response, arriving in Bangkok the day after the email, retaining lawyers immediately, filing a preliminary injunction against the proposed share issuance within 72 hours, had disrupted their timeline in ways that gave us a window. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate. It was not a good settlement. There is no good settlement in a situation of this kind. There is only the best available outcome from a bad position. What I recovered, after legal fees in both Thailand and Australia totaling AUD $87,000, was $219,000, against $612,000 invested. A loss of $393,000, roughly 2/3 of everything I had put in. In exchange, I surrendered all interest in the company, terminated my lease by mutual agreement, and signed a document that precluded me from making any public claim against either Bue or Arthit arising from the business relationship. I am therefore describing this in general terms. I am not identifying the resort, the location within Koh Samui, or the specific legal entities involved. I am telling you what happened to me. The resort is operating. I have seen photographs. It came up on a hospitality industry website, in a feature about boutique properties on the island, the kind of feature I had imagined reading about my own place. It looks exactly as I designed it. The villas are as I specified them. The pool is positioned as I positioned it. The garden plantings I supervised are mature now, the tropical species filling in the way the landscape designer said they would. In the feature photographs, Bui stands on the central pavilion deck looking out across the slope. She looks like someone who belongs there. She looks like someone who built something she loves. I am in Sydney. I have $132,000 left after the settlement, the legal costs, and what I have spent living since. I am 61. The $219,000 recovery plus residual savings minus ongoing costs. That is my financial position. I had $720,000 2.5 years ago. I have $132,000 today. The difference is a resort on a Thai island that I visited for the last time in a taxi to the airport at 5:30 in the morning, watching the road signs recede in the rear window as the driver took the coastal route, the sea occasionally visible between the trees in the pre-dawn dark, black and flat and very large. I do not regret going to Thailand. That would be too simple. I regret specific decisions, specific moments of choosing not to ask the question I should have asked, specific instances of trusting an arrangement because trusting it was more convenient than the alternative. I regret not hiring my own lawyer from day one rather than using the structure Bouet recommended. I regret not verifying the filed corporate documents against the drafts I reviewed. I regret not understanding that in a business structure where your legal protection depends entirely on the good faith of the majority Thai shareholder, the question of who that person actually is and what they actually want is not a secondary consideration. It is the only consideration. Let me be direct about the thing that is hardest to say. I was a reformed playboy. I knew it. I had spent the better part of 2 decades using my ambition as a substitute for genuine connection. And by the time I arrived in Thailand, I was 60 years old and I wanted, badly, to do something that mattered beyond the transaction. I wanted to build something beautiful and lasting, and I wanted to do it with someone who understood what I was trying to do. Bui understood exactly what I was trying to do. That was not coincidence. It was research. The professional credibility, the industry knowledge, the specific fluency in the hospitality market language I spoke. All of it was real, and all of it was also a tool for establishing trust with a person who could be predicted to respond to exactly that kind of competence. She found the version of me that was most vulnerable and spoke to it precisely. The legacy obsession. My lawyer's term for it was emotional investment disproportionate to risk assessment. What it means in plain language is this. I wanted to leave something behind badly enough that I was willing to overlook the things I should not have overlooked. The desire to matter, at 60, outran the judgment I had spent 60 years accumulating. That is the thing that actually happened to me. The money is almost secondary to that. If you are thinking about a significant property or business investment in Thailand with a Thai partner, here is what I should have done and didn't. Hire a lawyer with no connection whatsoever to any party in the transaction, before any documentation is signed, before any money moves, before you have an emotional investment in the outcome. Have that lawyer verify every filed document against the drafts. Understand the Thai company structure not as your partner explains it to you, but as an independent expert explains it to you. Know who the third-party shareholders are, what entities they represent, and what the relationship is between those entities and your partner. Do not assume that a draft you reviewed is the same as a document that was filed. They are not always the same. In my case, they were not the same. And if someone in your position, a retired professional with industry expertise, money to invest, and a desire to build one last thing, tells you that they have found the perfect partner in a market they don't fully understand, tell them about me. Tell them that expertise in one context is not protection in another. Tell them that the sophistication of the trap is usually calibrated to the sophistication of the target. Tell them that the more you know, the more convincing a competent lie needs to be, and the more convincing a lie is, the more dangerous it is. The bird on the slope called every morning at the same time. I never found out what kind it was. I asked Anurag the architect once, and he said he didn't know the English name, only the Thai one, which I couldn't remember by the time I thought to write it down. I think about it sometimes. That descending whistle, the light coming across the slope in the late afternoon, the way the pool looked at dusk when the garden lights came on, and the water turned a particular shade that had no name I knew. I built something beautiful. They took it. At 61, with $132,000 and a rental apartment and the particular knowledge of a man who has made every possible mistake at the highest possible cost, I am trying to figure out what comes after that. I genuinely do not know. There is something I have not told you yet about the confrontation in the pavilion because I skipped over it to get to the legal mechanics and the numbers. But the legal mechanics and the numbers are not actually the part that stays with me. The part that stays with me is the 20 minutes after the initial exchange, when Bue and I sat across the operations desk from each other in the place I had built and had what I can only describe as the most honest conversation of our entire relationship. Which is a strange thing to say about a conversation in which I had discovered I had been systematically deceived for 2 years. But honest is the right word, because for the first time since I had met her, she was not managing what she showed me. She told me, and I believe this was true, I still believe it, that the original plan, when she and Arthit had identified me as a potential investor at that networking evening in Chaweng, had not included the full execution of what actually happened. The plan had been simpler: a minority foreign investor who would provide capital, take his minority position, and remain in Australia for most of the year while the property was managed locally. She had not anticipated that I would move to the island. She had not anticipated that I would be on site 3 or 4 days a week, or that I would develop the kind of operational involvement and emotional connection to the project that I did. The gradual shift in what they had to do to complete the consolidation, the substituted articles, the planned share issuance, the more elaborate structure, was, in her telling, partly a response to the complications created by my presence. Which is, I grant you, a remarkable thing to say to someone as a form of partial explanation for having defrauded them. I did not feel in that conversation the rage that I had expected to feel. What I felt was a kind of exhausted clarity. I had built something in the genuine belief that I was building it with a partner, and the partner had been a construction of a different kind, a structure assembled specifically to extract what I was willing to bring, which was money and expertise and the particular credibility that a retired hospitality professional with a track record lends to a project that is seeking to position itself in a competitive market. She had needed what I had. She had taken it, and in taking it, she had been, in her own terms, entirely pragmatic. I am not excusing it. I am trying to understand it accurately, because understanding it accurately is the only thing that might prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. There is also a part of the story that relates to Lucas, the German man who sent the anonymous email, that I think is important. After the settlement was concluded, I was in contact with him several times over a period of months, partly because I was trying to understand the full history of what Bue and Arthit had done, and partly because, and I want to be transparent about this, I felt a responsibility to do what he had done for me: make sure the information was available to whoever came next. Lucas told me that after his own experience, he had spent several months trying to find a channel through which to warn people, and had eventually concluded that the most effective thing was direct contact with whoever the next investor was, if he could identify them. He had learned about me from the expat community on Samui, where news of a large-scale resort development in the Lamai hinterland was not entirely secret. What Lucas and I eventually did, and I am including this not to make myself sound heroic, because I am not, and the outcome was imperfect, was provide detailed information to a journalist writing about property fraud patterns involving foreign investors in Thai hospitality markets. We did not name individuals. We described structures, timelines, legal mechanisms, and the specific warning signs that we had both ignored. The piece was published in a business magazine and generated a small amount of attention in the expat community in Thailand. It did not recover my money. It did not, as far as I know, prevent every subsequent investor from making the same mistakes. But it is something. It is the opposite of silence, which is what Bue and Arthit were counting on. The reliable silence of men who are too ashamed of what happened to them to describe it clearly. I want to say something about shame, because I think it is the mechanism that allows this kind of fraud to perpetuate. The men who go through what I went through, and they are mostly men, mostly Western, mostly of a certain age and financial profile, are not primarily deterred from talking about it by legal agreements, though those agreements exist. They are deterred by shame, by the specific, acute, gendered shame of a man who believes he should have known better, who built his identity on professional competence and financial judgment, who allowed himself to be played by someone he trusted, and who cannot tell that story without the telling of it revealing exactly the kind of vulnerability he has spent his life concealing. The reformed playboy archetype, to give it its sharpest edge, a man who spent decades treating relationships as secondary to ambition, and then, when he finally tried to invest himself in something real, found that the investing itself was the mechanism of his undoing. That is a hard thing to say about yourself in public. I am saying it anyway, because the alternative is the thing Arthit was banking on, that I would take the settlement, sign the document, get on the plane, and never speak about it in any form that could be traced back to the people who did it. He was wrong about that, partly because of Lucas, who showed me that saying something was possible, and partly because I am 61 years old, and I have $132,000 and a rental apartment, and I have very little left to lose by being precise. The specific warning signs I missed, in approximate chronological order, because someone needs to list them plainly, the recommendation to use the partner's own lawyer rather than seeking independent counsel for the company formation, the production of draft documents rather than filed documents for review, the minority foreign shareholding structure that appeared standard, but contained within it a sufficiently complex allocation among the Thai shareholders that the effective majority control was not obvious without comparing documents side by side. The absence, at any point, of a thorough and independent due diligence into the background of the majority Thai director that would have revealed the personal and professional relationship with the company's own lawyer, and the specific warning from Craig in January, which was not precise enough to be actionable, but which pointed toward something real that I chose not to investigate. Any one of these, properly pursued, would have revealed the structure before I had transferred the majority of my capital into it. I cannot recover the money. The settlement figure is what it is, and the legal system is what it is, and the honest assessment from every lawyer I have spoken to is that further litigation would be expensive, uncertain, and unlikely to produce a materially better outcome than the one I have. So $132,000 it is. And a rented apartment. And the knowledge, which has a particular weight that money cannot balance, of exactly how this happened, and exactly when I had the opportunity to stop it, and chose not to. If there is anything that functions as a counterweight to that knowledge, it is this. I built something that is standing. Whatever happened legally and financially, the design was mine. The decisions about the layout and the positioning and the materials were mine. The vision of what that slope on Koh Samui could become was mine. The thing I built is beautiful, and it is operational, and it is receiving guests and generating revenue, and someone is writing about it in hospitality industry features. I did not have the right to keep it, but I made it, and the making was real, and the making was mine, and that cannot be transferred to another company structure, or signed away in a settlement agreement, or taken from me by any legal mechanism that has ever been invented. Whether that is enough comfort to sustain a 61-year-old man in a Surrey Hills apartment with $132,000 and no clear path to what comes next, I honestly cannot tell you. Some days it feels like enough. Some days it feels like the least consoling thing I have ever thought. But it is true. And when you have lost most of what you had, the things that are true become the ones worth keeping.